This is an RNZ podcast.
Well, Colin, there's been a lot of a lot of stuff has happened over the past week, hasn't it? And when stuff happens, the media reports on it. And, there has been a lot of media coverage of some big stories over the past few days. Let's start with the biggest one of all, the Trump, Vance, Zelensky, the meltdown of relations between the US and Ukraine very publicly. It happened live on TV, Cole. This is a very unusual situation.
Yes, it is unusual for all that to happen in the Oval Office quite like it did. I mean, how many times have you seen like really boring images of, seated politicians, shaking hands, facing the media, all the microphone booms dangling over them, and it just looks so standard that you almost tune out visually and mentally. But very different with those two. You had the Vice President, J.D. Vance, as well as Trump, and then of course we all saw what erupted. I sort of feel like initially people might have overreacted to the significance of what actually happened, and that neither of those guys, Trump or Vance, seems shy of, just letting it all hang out, saying what they think in front of the cameras, even though it's very undiplomatic or might cause them problems. Some people suggested this might have been an ambush all set up by Trump or his people, and actually to create a kind of TV moment, partly because at some point, Trump did say this is going to be great TV. But I have the feeling that Trump would say that any TV that features him would be great TV,
Yeah, right.
Making television great again or whatever. And, you also have to wonder, he has once or twice said of Zelensky when he was trying to demean him in his social media, I think he called him moderately successful television comedian or something like that. Yeah. So maybe he personally feels like he still thinks of himself as a TV star, and he doesn't want to be outshined by any other TV star turned president. But
Donald Trump was never the voice of Paddington in Paddington 2, unlike Volodymyr Zelensky. So he'll never have that, Colin.
He was?
Yeah, Zelensky was the voice of Paddington in the film, the great film, cruelly snubbed at the Oscars, Paddington 2.
Can't give an Oscar to a puppet movie. We're off the
You
topic.
said it, Cole. You said it.
We're off the topic. What are you drawing me into here? but anyway,
Mediawatch at rnz.co.nz is the place for puppet enthusiasts to send their hate mail to Colin Peacock.
I think I get hate mail from within my own household where they've made many family trips to see the Paddington movies, but
piece of cinema, yes. And sorry, I've taken you off track.
No, it's fine.
Colin,
well, that's what segue time. That's what Donald Trump is doing, I think, in creating that kind of exposure. I mean, because you could tell from his previous comments he was wavering about Ukraine. We know about his interest in Putin's thoughts and appreciation for him. You could see which way this was going. I have a feeling that so-called meltdown didn't really create the schism that people thought it would, and breakdown of relationships with Europe and the NATO implications, all that stuff was already rolling out anyway, I think.
Donald Trump also made addressed Congress today. That was another big set piece for television.
It was a long one.
Yeah.
Nearly 2 hours, I think. Yeah. Just kind of, I watched the start, watched a bit more, and then I listened to some of it riding my bike to get to RNZ, and I don't know if it's worse to listen without the pictures, but the kind of what do you call it, adoration, the standing ovations, all of it, quite weird, but possibly standard for presidents giving
that's just
addresses.
America, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. You almost expect balloons to come down from the ceiling, but they didn't go that far.
Yeah.
But, at one point, he was saying about this tariff regimes and all the things he was doing, we are just getting started, and that was 40 minutes into the speech, and I think what he might have meant was we're just getting started on the speech, because it went on and on and on. He really badly needs an editor. It was funny, Jeff Zeleny, national affairs correspondent for CNN, said at the time, the president's been speaking for over an hour. He has more personal stories to go, not to mention the section of his speech on Ukraine is still to come up. Settle in, folks. And David Axelrod, former senior advisor to Obama, then said to CNN, look, it's 5:30 a.m. in Kiev. Maybe he's such a TV guy, he's planning to speak long enough so, the breakfast time Ukrainian audience will listen up and actually hear him address the war. But it just went on, and I honestly don't know how people put up with stuff that I know we've talked about this before, that weird habit of you'd never have assumed, when people started talking about video and morselization and short, sharp stuff and short attention spans, you couldn't have predicted Joe Rogan podcast going on for, 2.5 hours. But this sort of thing, I just wonder if anybody can stomach it. The impact of it, just of what he's saying.
Well, I mean, clearly
fall off a cliff.
Clearly, some people can stomach it. Otherwise, presumably, he wouldn't be doing it. But perhaps the media should expect more of this.
That's the thing. It's a set piece. It's the president's thing. It's in the calendar. They'll do it no matter what. Just same as the Oscars could go on forever and ever. Everyone agrees it's too long and too boring, but it's still broadcast. It's a set piece. It's in the calendar. So, I mean, Trump and Vance are opportunists, and I think this is part of what they know.
It's also sparked a lot of comment about whether politicians more than ever are tailoring their behaviour for the media.
Yeah, I think so. Like, when I mentioned that, Vance as a vice president, you wouldn't expect him to be in the Oval Office, alongside his president. I think they were both showing off, so that was something they probably did plan in advance. And Zelensky got praise for having left the building, or depending on other reports, they were saying you've got to go, and making his exit after the so-called meltdown. That he jumped on Twitter, or X as it now is, and was then reposting all the times he had thanked other world leaders for their support, having been put on the spot by J.D. Vance and said, when have you ever said thank you? And, turns out when the fact checkers got onto it, at least 33 times he hasn't publicly, thanked. But, we're in a post-fact checking world now, for sure. So, but I think there's possibly another way of looking at what you mentioned there, about whether they're tailoring their behaviour for the internet. Maybe the internet is tailoring them. And I thought this, trying to actually avoid Trump-type content, I listened to the podcast of UK, the Private Eye magazine in the UK, the podcast called Page 94. And they talked about, they'd had a couple of these conservative, small C conservative conferences in the UK. One was a UK version of CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, the sort of right-wing tub-thumping fundraising things they have, mostly in the States, but they've had them in Australia. They're becoming a worldwide thing. And there was another one, there was an outfit called, I think it's ARC, I think it's Association of Responsible Citizens, or Citizenship or something. And its patron is kind of Jordan Peterson, who seems to be making some sort of comeback. So the current and one former leader of a Conservative Party in the UK gave speeches at these things. Also Nigel Farage, who's currently an MP, leader of the Reform Party and a disruptor in British politics. They all gave speeches at this thing, which were just kind of barking. If you laid them out, they were very much like internet stuff. And Nigel Farage, for instance, told the CPAC conference everyone in the UK was miserable. They were hating life under a left-wing government, and also backed up what others in the American right-wing are saying about Europe and the UK lacking free speech. Here's what the Private Eye editor Ian Hislop had to say in response to seeing that.
Traditionally, we didn't like people going abroad and slagging off our country. And I mean, to be honest, the right has made a lot of people slagging off their country over the years being one of the major problems. But to literally hear a man on quite an agreeable weekend, I mean, I did go out a bit when I wasn't on the internet. It seemed to me there were a lot of people having a very nice weekend. A lot of people engaged in activities that weren't being locked up for a failure of free speech. I just thought, you are now beginning just to sound like a mad person online.
Yeah, I think he's right. I think political figures might be spending too much time on the internet, or with advisors who are, because they know other people are. I think they're sort of adopting positions that a lot of people would think are actually, like, if not mad, then just peripheral and irrelevant. I have a feeling that's what's going on.
But, I mean, I guess a reasonable question to that would be, how do we know what people think about things, if not through the internet? I mean, the internet is a place where people do express their opinions on things. Perhaps it's in a way that they wouldn't in real life. But,
yeah, but wouldn't you be expecting that people would then distill from that what it is people want to know? Skilled communicators. I mean, as an example, in that podcast, they talked about Liz Truss, who I know has become a kind of comic figure, but she tours the world now speaking at these things.
Yeah.
Well, basically goes to the US a lot and talk. And she was speaking at this, I think this ARC event, and talking about that USAID had funded social enterprises that ended up funding a podcast by Rory Stewart, who is like a former British Conservative politician who's now a podcast. And like the audience didn't know what the hell she was on about. There's such fringe stuff. And you'd be thinking, well, what's the point of this? It's a bit like, almost the reverse of, when John Key got all those plaudits for saying, I think, I can't recall the issue, something to do with Kim.com or whatever, or Edward Snowden. And he was saying, I think Kiwis are more concerned about the snapper quota. And it's, that's the quote for the ages. This shows how he cuts through with ordinary New Zealanders and so on. I wonder if politicians now kind of lose that because of the internet, or at risk of doing it. Some certainly are.
Right, that the internet and views shared on the internet are taking sort of outsized space in terms of the perception of how people think and what's important to people.
Yeah, I think that is partly what's happening.
Let's turn an eye inwards then, shall we, and look at the New Zealand media sector. You last week on Mediawatch mentioned a mischievous report from Australia suggesting Zuru founder Nick Mowbray might buy NZME. He is not doing that, but it has emerged this week that another billionaire has bought into NZME.
Yeah, that story in the Australian newspapers, a gossipy thing, did say a Canadian billionaire might be interested. So the Nick Mowbray angle, not so much, but this one did. So yeah, Canadian private equity tycoon James Grennan took just over a 9% stake in NZME and paid $9 million or so for it. And according to the statement to the NZX, no current intention to make a takeover bid. So people have seized on that word, current. But the interesting thing about him is that he backed a couple of news ventures, one called NZNE, New Zealand News Essentials, which is widely regarded to be kind of trolling NZME with those initials. And that later got folded into another thing that he previously backed, I think until about mid-2023, called The Centrist, which said it was created to challenge established mainstream outlets. It had, anonymous content, but a lot of it, actual media criticism, complaining about the MSM and its biases and stuff. So, yeah, it's an interesting, he makes him an interesting investor.
But so why would someone so critical of him with such disdain for the mainstream media, who was financially backing alternatives, end up buying into one of the biggest mainstream media companies in New Zealand?
Yeah, I guess we make the assumption there that this thing, The Centrist, it does reflect his own opinions and interests, but I mean, it must do. So it's a question that Grennan himself hasn't answered. Fairly private person. RNZ's Farah Hancock did try to get in touch. She had previously done stories crunching numbers about the money that was being spent on political advertising during the election in 2023. And Grennan spent quite a lot, didn't want to talk about it, responded to emails to her, but said, look, he wants that to speak for himself. So he said to RNZ that he has nothing to say about the decision to buy the shares, at least for the time being. So we'll see. Business Desk also reported that NZME, for their part, had said, look, they have no contact with him. But certainly one who celebrated this was Chantel Baker, daughter of Leighton Baker and, a alternative media content creator herself. She had a defamation case against the New Zealand Herald reporting stories about her a couple of years back, and it turns out that that Mr. Grennan backed those. He's also backing other cases, and he's in the corner of Julian Batchelor of Stop Co-Governance in a lawsuit against TVNZ and the Disinformation Project, that academic group that wound up a lot of people opposed to vaccine mandates and so on in COVID times. And Chantel Baker went on X and said she is beyond excited that Mr. Grennan now has a stake in the MSM, and said this was an important wedge and progress for like-minded people. So we'll see. It's a very weird position, I think, for NZME to have a stakeholder who kind of backed rival news outlets that actually, when you look at the Centrist online now in its current form, even though I don't think Grennan's involved with it, it literally piggybacks on the news of the Herald, RNZ and Stuff. It produces what look like AI-written sort of summaries and then says, read the full story here at Stuff or the Herald. So at the same time, it's ripping into mainstream media for not telling you the truth about things, about co-governance and climate science and COVID, etc. It's actually using the links to the legit stories to bulk up its appearance as a credible actual news site.
NZME did release its results last week. We talked to Hayden about them on Midweek Mediawatch last Wednesday. Is that timing relevant potentially?
Yeah, it's possible. Tim Murphy, former Herald editor, now the co-editor at Newsroom, wrote a piece about this a couple of days back where he says, it's possible his backing for a new approach in media might sit comfortably with NZME's newfound desire to set a different tone for New Zealand. And that's because, as I think you spoke about with Hayden, NZME announced, along with its results, this mission of setting a new tone for New Zealand, highlighting economic stories of success. And it also occurred to Tim Murphy in his article and other people that this thing about building positive momentum is, or he put it, a stance open to political interpretation. Others would say, it very closely reflects the current position and messaging of the government about economic growth. Tim Murphy described it as a knowing nod to the business community that NZME sniffs change in the political and financial winds. And Hayden is currently in touch with NZME, trying to, maybe for the weekend Mediawatch, trying to find out what it is that NZME actually means by this reflecting positive economic news and contributing to the conversation.
Yeah, positivity, I suppose, being in the eye of the beholder. This is sort of like the Amazon billionaire Jeff Bezos deciding that the Washington Post, which he owns, would only feature opinion pieces in favour of the free market and individual liberty. This was an astonishing directive last week.
Yeah, it really is. Long way from democracy dies in darkness and all that stuff. Yeah, it sort of has that vibe. But the thing to remember is, Bezos bought the Washington Post wholesale with this small change from Amazon and other stuff. James Grennan only has less than 10% of NZME, so it's not quite the same thing. And Tim Murphy actually made another interesting point in his piece to say you don't have to go back that far when, before the days of NZME, the Herald was owned by a company called APN, and that was owned by an Irish billionaire, Sir Anthony Riley, who had lots of media, O'Reilly, who had lots of media properties, Tony O'Reilly as he was better known, and before that the Wilson and Horton, the Horton family, local moneyed people. So it's not unaccustomed to having people with money and probably views and a wider stake and other things, as owners.
Yes, indeed. Perhaps there's a new best way to make a small fortune joke on the horizon at some stage. Speaking of billionaires in our media, another billionaire who could have an impact on our media, our sports media, DAZN. DAZN may be entering the ring when it comes to the purchasing sports rights. Yeah,
this is a story that came up last week that they were interested in, that the talks might have been held. So DAZN, a lot of people don't know it, or DAZN as you might see it in print. Founded, owned by, or substantially owned by the UK billionaire Sir Len Blavatnik. So it's very quickly become a huge sports broadcaster. And according to the Herald last week, it wants to outbid Sky for the rights to All Blacks and international rugby.
I mean, this will really send some warning bells through Sky, you'd think. I mean, elite live rugby, the bedrock of that company's success. Is this likely to happen? What do you...
Well, I don't know. They'll put up a fight if it's true, for sure, with the rugby union. And I don't know if it's still... Remember there was a deal that Sky actually bought?
Yeah, they're minority shareholders in New Zealand rugby, as I recall.
But whether that holds sway when it comes to rights, who knows?
Well, surely.
Yeah,
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
But when there have been other threats and when have been up for negotiation or the possibility of some international streamer getting involved, the Sky's always come out on top and paid what it takes. But this week, the Herald's Gregor Paul, who first broke that story, he's updated that and said TVNZ now appears could be the kingmaker. So, insert Winston Peters' reference here, which he certainly did. Because, if he did, that the deal, any deal or conflict between Sky and DAZN, it could be a Sky TVNZ combo that wins out.
And that is, the appeal of TVNZ is what? Is a free-to-air partner for whoever gets the live rugby rights?
Yeah, so that's the possibility. So what Gregor Paul says, it's morphed into bipartisan negotiations with TVNZ. A small but significant component, these are Gregor's words, kept free-to-air TV on TVNZ and TVNZ Plus. That is now being touted by well-placed sources as entirely viable and under serious consideration. So we'll have to see where that goes. And they also have, of course, on the TVNZ side, ex-Sky executive and actual rugby player Melody Robinson, and she's now got quite a high position in the structure, so she will certainly be involved in whatever they end up negotiating.
We got about 3 minutes left, Colin, to chat a bit about your your viewing habits. You've been watching some travelogue type programs. Colin, tell me about
just
this.
really quickly. It was a two-parter. Miriam Margolis did a travel show about New Zealand. She lives in Australia. She's British. She's in her 80s. She lives in Australia.
She's wonderful.
Yeah, well, a lot of people love it. I don't know, these sort of old actors that then break out into travel TV, there's so many of them in the UK, so many of these series. I'm a bit wary, but Graham Smith of RNZ did a great review where he made it sound like it was obviously for an international audience, so some of the references might be a bit cringy, but he said she really does get off the beaten track and into culture and politics that you wouldn't expect in a standard travelogue. Can we have a bit of audio if we've got time?
Yeah, by all means.
She went all the way to Southland to meet Bryce McKenzie and Laurie, the founders of Groundswell, and tried to give them a little tickle with a bit of jokes as a sort of almond milk non-dairy drinker. They did not respond that well to her jokes.
Groundswell is a focus of opposition to what?
To unworkable regulations.
What do you mean?
People tend to look at farming as being the main contributor to climate change, particularly in the methane area.
Because it's the methane,
Yes.
the farting,
Yes.
that is causing the problem. And I'm a great farter. I don't know if you are.
Yeah, all right.
But I laughing. Wait till one wafts over to you, mate. The methane is much more deadly to the atmosphere than carbon dioxide.
Yeah, we're not quite so sure.
Right.
Different tone. We're not quite so sure about that here at Groundswell. Yeah, they were not really responding. But I mean, the thing is, I'm not that taken with Miriam Margolis. It still feels to me like kind of overcooking things and with the personality. But she does get out and about. She goes to schools, drives that camper van herself. She really, really does do it. She went to meet Abdulaziz, the guy who confronted the terrorist at Linwood Mosque and received the country's highest honour. These are quite emotional and personal interviews. So in the end, it's very different to the usual fly in, fly out sort of travelogue.
And always interesting, I suppose, to see how people not from New Zealand perceive New Zealand when they are, professionally perceiving New Zealand, I guess, for something like a documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Colin Peacock,
thanks so much. And next time we come, could we play the one from 50 years earlier, which is an NZBC production, which is an expat New Zealand broadcaster who takes the tone, having lived the high life in the UK, comes to see how if Aotearoa is becoming more cosmopolitan. It's 1972, and I think we should play that as a coda to Miriam Margolis' series.
In a restaurant that offered more than just fuel, I lunched with an old broadcasting colleague and freelance writer, Peter Kay. A line from the poem written by the scurrilous Englishman in the 50s about New Zealand, of our eating habits, ice cream and mutton swirled around in tea. Well, even in my brief return home, I've noticed enormous improvement in eating habits. They're much more sophisticated. Wines like this one, to drink them 10, 12 years ago would have been unthinkable.
It's quite different 50 years earlier.